There's a difference between the interfaces and the barriers. And the barriers are one response to the problem of contentious interfaces. And interfaces being the buffer, the boundary zone between Protestant and Catholic working class communities. Now,
one has to understand the principle of territoriality and the history that goes back over 150 to 200 years of ownership of a line on the ground, and how really important it is to that community not to lose that.
Now, the process of having a barrier erected is that there is A, there's trouble, and B, that the police make a recommendation to the Northern Ireland Office, and the Northern Ireland Office accept that recommendation. That's the basic series, and then they send the builders in.
So the projects are also visionary projects, not necessarily possible, but trying to imagine and to give ideas, even if they are not realistic. But well, we try to ground them as much as possible.
When you start to map out the walls and fences around the city, there's a difference between, I mean, on one hand there's interfaces, there's a kind of contentious hotspots between the two communities. There's another section which is the peace lines, which are technically the interface barriers, which are NIO interface barriers. And there's others which are equally security/defensive walls, but which are perhaps look like peace lines, but technically are not built by the NIO and therefore don't fall within that list. The actual boundaries are kind of getting to the stage where they're hardwired in people's heads. So, that's why it's difficult to shift them, because they grow up with these boundaries and you can't move the boundaries. But also people know, through very early learned practice as to where you go.
We had this discussion about the fact that probably to demolish them is not possible, but what we can do is just to kind of eat them into something else. Because they were there, but they can become something else.
If you think about the walls perhaps less as a kind of a physical event on the landscape, you can also look at it as kind of an interruption in relationships. So they're there because relationships between those communities have broken down and have become hostile and violent experience. They're like on a slope and conveyor belt, in which the Catholics are moving in one side and the Protestants are moving out the other side. And they're transitional areas. And there's very few areas that have actually consolidated as knit.
The big picture is clearly of a Protestant community on retreat. I mean, you could look at the census figures for 1971, 81, 91, 2001, and you will see that the whole Protestant community is moving towards the eastern seaboard. It's like lemmings heading for the cliff. I mean, they move from Derry to Coleraine, from Uri to Banbury.
Catholics in Ardouin talk about Glenbryn having tennis courts in their gardens, because that's their perception of the amount of space they've got. And so there's a big sense within the Catholic areas that there's an unfairness maintained by all these peace lines.
I mean, even things like, the fact that there's Cooper Way, the one where everybody's signing, and the fact that tourists are now associated with that wall.
I know when I was down there last week, actually, so I saw there around, there was a taxi driver pulled up with a taxi full of people.
Yeah, and they handed a pen. They said, "You want to sign our wall?"
Right.
So that's part of the whole thing. But even things like that, I think, changed the nature of how. I mean, of course, it has a physical presence, but it then also changed the nature of how people on the ground mentally perceive that wall. Because it's somehow also become it's big, great thing stuff, and people over there doing stuff that sort of. But it's also kind of true. It's strange.
Yeah.
I think territories will change. There's still physical territory still really important, but I think the mental territory will change first, and then there'll be. That's we were talking about yesterday. The closer of the walls, that you know, if you thought about York without its city walls, that people would be appalled. You know, it may well come to a point where people would be appalled taking down the walls because they're actually becoming such a definitive part of the Belfast, you know.
Well, if they were made of stone, possibly I would see some justification in it. Some of these things are so awful looking, you know.
Well, it's strange enough. I mean, I was going around the walls with some of the people in interface as well recently, and there are some parts of them that artists and myself kind of like the look of.
Yeah. For example, if you had a cleared area, as some of the North Belfast parts are cleared away, and you decided to, if it lay fallow for 10, 15 years or something like that, so that memories would sort of forget that there are parts of North Belfast, as you can see, would be like it. If you could persuade the private sector to build houses, heavily subsidised or whatever, they might be occupied by Catholic families, but the likelihood is that it would be firebombed. We designed a scheme with houses facing in towards the Ardoyne, which is here. Okay. Now, any other part of the world, you don't design houses with their backs onto the main road. They're the other way around. So that scheme was going through the system whenever they decided to stop the housing executive from building its own houses and rely on housing associations. So the land was sold to a housing association who immediately redrew the plan and turned the houses around to face the street. And when the houses were put up, there was a territorial claim on the street, and you could see in the nature of perception. Yeah. And so the Protestant people coming down here felt threatened, were physically threatened, but generally reacted in a very foolish manner by saying, well, if you're going to threaten us, we're going to threaten you. And so the whole thing escalated into almost an international proportions, you know, over the head of it. And it's that question of territorial ownership simply by returning our houses to face a road. You know, actually, my son and daughter were over at the weekend. They were down in Hughes Bar, and they told me that they suddenly heard this noise of a military army Land Rover coming roaring up the road, and then they heard a lot of high-pitched girly giggles, and it was a hen party. It was really good to hire an army vehicle.